Good morning. Welcome,
Good
Constantine
morning.
Vardavas.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome APACT 2021 members. Here is our meeting room number 3. The first session is a TID workshop. Tip from the journal editors, how to write your manuscript for a peer-reviewed journal. I would like to welcome Constantine Vardavas. Please enjoy her.
Good morning. I have some slides to share. It is early in the morning here in Greece. It's 6 o'clock in the morning, so it's an early morning session for me. And I don't know, can you hear me loud and clear? Can you hear me?
Please sharing your screen. Yes.
So, good morning. Can I start?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's
Welcome.
a good morning from me. My name is Constantine Vardavas. I'm the Strategic Development Editor of the journal Tobacco Use Diseases. Tobacco use disease has an impact factor of 2.6, and its aim is to connect researchers across the globe on tobacco control initiatives. So together with the co-editor-in-chief, which is Dr. Gaku, we've prepared a slide deck on how to prepare a paper for a peer-reviewed journal, what to expect in a peer-reviewed journal, what an editor is looking for, things like that, just for the people who are participating in APACT, which is a pity it's not in person this year, but it's really looking forward to coming to Thailand. But in this session, we'd like within 1 hour and 45 minutes to be able to provide an overview of what an editor is looking for, what sessions are included within a manuscript, what should be done in each part of the manuscript, and I think we'll start off with like that. I don't know whether I can receive questions as we're moving ahead, if there is such an ability. If there is an ability to receive questions, you can always very simply start off with the questions whenever you have them. No need to wait to the end. I don't know if there's some sort of a way to do that via a messaging underneath, but it's open for discussion. So let's start off with as what we do, and these slides are based on a specific also course that we also run at the Harvard School of Dental Medicine on the complex analysis, interpretation, design of complex survey data. So it's a very similar topic to what we do also in the Dental Public Health Program at the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. So, in principle, what does an editor look for within a peer-reviewed journal? First of all, we always have a question, and this is a very common question pops up, is, okay, I have a manuscript, it's submitted to a journal. What happens there? What's the next steps? First of all, when a manuscript is received in a journal, an initial screening takes place. Imagine if every manuscript that is submitted to a journal goes out to double-blind peer review. That's a huge effort on behalf of peer reviewers, and remember, peer reviewers are not compensated to do work, and rarely are editors. So would be a lot of work for every single manuscript to go out for peer review. And also, in a lot of cases, it would waste time for the actual author itself if the manuscript is not suitable for the journal. So the first thing that happens is the authors, when they submit, is that the handling editor or the editorial team, they assess first of all if the letter, the manuscript is actually addressed to the correct journal. It has happened that in some cases that a manuscript has just been transferred from one journal to another, and its formatting, its title, its approach is obviously for another journal. The second aspect that's assessed is the topic fits for the journal. For instance, in tobacco use diseases, you have it's a tobacco-related journal, tobacco prevention-related journal. If there's, for instance, a manuscript that's talking about the impact of diabetes, for instance, in a population, but it's unrelated to tobacco, then it's not fit within the journal. So as a general topic, it would fit within the journal. Of course, is the manuscript complete? Because sometimes you may have uploaded, or someone may have uploaded a manuscript that's missing tables or references, and that makes it very difficult for a peer reviewer then to be able to have a proper picture of what is in the journal. And in general, whether the authors follow the instructions to the authors. The last point, though, is not too important because there's always some flexibility. Whether the references are in the right format, it doesn't really make too much of a difference when you're submitting the journal. But in its revisions, it's always good to be able to make sure that the instructions to the authors are followed. There's some flexibility, in other words, in the last step. So the first read is done by the handling editor, and it assesses the fit within the journal, whether the manuscript presents new data, whether the manuscript moves the field forward. Is it something new that we're learning? Is it a repetition of what has already been published and talked about? So we're looking whether the data does is something new. If it moves the field forward, is there a gap that's clearly identified? So usually when you're starting a manuscript, you have a problem that the manuscript's trying to solve. So you have to identify, first of all, what is this problem? It may be, what is the impact of an intervention for smoking cessation, or is this being clearly defined? Are the analysis reasonable, appropriate? Have there been, and we'll talk about that later on the day-to-day in the morning. Yes, someone has the microphone open, and I'm hearing a lot of discussion. So are the analysis reasonable, appropriate? Are the conclusions reasonable given the data? For instance, you can't have a manuscript that talks about smoking cessation intervention in an area, and the conclusions say that a mass media campaign should take place, for instance. Those two things are very different from what is in the study and what's being published. Are the conclusions reasonable given the data? Are the references current and appropriate, which is again not too important? And are the tables, figures understandable? They are very clear. So the two different things between what is a perfect paper and what is a real paper. Now, when people start writing manuscripts, I remember as a master's student, when master's students start writing manuscripts, it's always thought that, it must be a perfect question, it must be a very important topic of clinical or public health interest, the question must be controversial, e-cigarettes for smoking cessation, things like that. It must be a hot topic, or COVID-19 and nicotine. But those is really an ideal paper in an ideal world. In the real world, the papers are really just next steps. And we're just moving things, adding a small brick to the wall of information. So while you may have in your mind, especially if one was a master's student, and what would be a perfect paper, there's rarely a perfect paper. There's always a small little additions to what is in the evidence. One of the first things that a handling editor looks for is a study design. Because the design must match the objectives for the research. So if one is trying to see the effectiveness of an intervention, then you'd have to do, for instance, look at a randomized controlled trial or some pre-post intervention. But if you're interested, for instance, at a population's exposure to secondhand smoke, for instance, in Thailand, then you'd want to know what type of cross-sectional study it is. So the actual design must match the objectives. You need a specific design to match a specific objective. Then the second step is whether the data is actually appropriately, is the data correct, is the data appropriate. In other words, if you want to look at the pre-post intervention, you have to see what are you measuring to see whether, for instance, an intervention for smoke-free homes, whether it changes or not the smoke-free homes in a population, you'd see what was measured. Was it indoor cotinine? Secondhand smoke PM 2.5. Is it cotinine? Is it nicotine? What was measured? Is it self-reported? When the analytical plan was appropriate for the data, they all must match the design, the data, and the plan. And of course, if participants are treated with respect, which is not a very important aspect, in which the editors in the first check that will ensure that, for instance, there's been ethics approval, and that's a very important point, having very clear ethics approval. Now, of course, when you have quantitative studies designed, there are two different types of studies. So the quantitative and qualitative. Now, quantitative is when you're effectively getting a more, let's say, bigger picture of things. And on the other side, qualitative is when you have more like focus groups, things like that. And again, when you're looking at quantitative study designs, for instance, a large cross-sectional study, and it checks whether the study design is appropriate to assess a hypothesis, whether there's information on confounding, which we'll talk about later on in the morning, whether there's sufficient power to do the study, and whether the results are generalizable to the population that we're referring to. So those are some of the things we look for in quantitative study design manuscripts. And in qualitative, this is more like focus groups and focus group discussions, things like that. The editors look really, and first this is all for a first check, whether the informants are appropriately engaged, there's a sufficient number of informants to reach saturation. So remember the difference between a quantitative and qualitative is that in qualitative work, you don't need too many participants because it's more in-depth, trying to understand the how and the mechanisms behind something. So you do not need hundreds and hundreds of people to respond. You only need a dozen, a few dozen. It's not a large sample size. So it's one of the big things that pops up also in the peer review is that a lot of, well, some peer reviewers, they assess a qualitative manuscript, keeping in mind though a quantitative manuscript. So let's say, for instance, oh, it's only a focus group of 20 people. No one can learn science from 20 people. That's the whole approach of focus groups. They're small sample sizes. On the other hand, if you have a big cross-sectional study, you can't say that, for instance, we're looking at the exposure of secondhand smoke in Malaysia, and then we're saying that we had a study of 50 people. It's not going to be generalizable to the population. So those are the two things we take into account. Another point, and this is something that is also very key, not so much to the editors, but later on to the peer reviewers, is the actual presentation, the actual way it's read. You think of it like watching a movie on television. If the movie is flowing easily and easy to understand, then it's more likely to be watched. If it's very difficult to understand who is the main character or who is talking to whom, and there's so many people inside that movie, then you start losing track. Same thing with a manuscript. You want it to flow very easily. It has a start, a middle, a beginning, an end, and flow. So it's a matter of experience when learning, and it's very useful to read a number of manuscripts. And of course, the more you read manuscripts, the more you understand what is the process to write the manuscripts and move that ahead. So presentation is very important. And one of the main points is bullet 4, that it adheres to the introduction, methods, results, and discussion breakdown. You want to make sure that the manuscript has these 4 main points. And the last point, and there are many tricks to organize that in quotation marks, is the manuscript must be well written. There's always a slight bias when English is not, an English manuscript or manuscript written in English is not written in perfect format, which makes things sometimes difficult for people from non-English speaking countries. I'm initially from Greece, so I've had that issue as well, and I see that also with colleagues. So what happens is that it's always good to have your manuscript spell checked, dramatically checked. There are many even software which I recommend to my colleagues or to my master students for writing. For instance, I use Grammarly. Okay, I'm a native English speaker, but I use Grammarly, and it helps me write easier. There are many other software that you can use, free software online that improve as you're writing a bit of the grammar and the syntax, which makes it easier. It also doesn't help to have your manuscript, doesn't harm, sorry, to have your manuscript read by someone else also, a colleague or a more senior colleague, or even someone at the same level, just to get a quick internal peer review before sending a manuscript out. So some of the flaws that we have, the things that really stop a manuscript from moving ahead, is that the studies that are confirmatory. In other words, they show nothing new, even though it's very difficult not to show something new in a manuscript, because even if it's a study that's been done a few years ago, even in the same area, things may have changed. Maybe a new smoke-free legislation, a new plain packaging being implemented, new graphic labeling being implemented. So there's always small things that can add to the literature. Another important point, which is the drawback, is if the data is very old. So it's now 2021. If we were to have data that is, for instance, in 2010, 2012, 2015, some things may have changed. This is especially pertinent when we're looking at population-based measures. For instance, as I said, secondhand smoke, experimentation with novel tobacco products, experimentation with e-cigarettes, smoking cessation. These things change very rapidly every year or every time period. What does not change, for instance, though, and there it's not too important about the data, is when we're looking at things that have, for instance, a biological mechanism, because human biology does not change within a few years. So, for instance, what's the impact of smoking on diabetes? What's the impact of smoking on blood pressure? Or what's the impact of smoking on head circumference in newborn children? This is not going to change. It's a biological mechanism, or not change too differently. So there you don't mind if the data is old, because the mechanism is stable. But if you have data, for instance, which is population-based, then it has to be relatively new. Also, an old references is another point to look up, especially if you may have a manuscript that's written in 2021 and the manuscript's references are all older. I usually use a rule of thumb, 10, 15 years as a rule of thumb. If things older than 10 years, I'm sure there's something new that covers that topic. And also a small number of participants. And why? Because a small number of participants stops the generalization of results. So you can't have a population-based study with 50 or 100 participants. It doesn't generalize to a population. So, and as for the intro of today's session, the overall assessment is then how much has been published on the topic. So if there's a topic, for instance, COVID-19 and smoking. But when COVID-19, the pandemic hit, there was nothing on COVID-19 and smoking. But now if you look on go to the PubMed or Scopus and you do smoking COVID-19, quite a lot has been published. So there's a different need in the beginning of the pandemic and different need now, for instance. And it says how much has been published, what's the novelty and innovation of the study, how novel it is. Important thing from a journal's perspective is, will it attract people to the journal? Will people read the manuscript? And this is one of the differences between the sort of like high journals in the field and TID, is that in tobacco-induced diseases, there's no, let's say, there's no rule that says this is studies of regional, has regional evidence and presents regional information is not of interest to the readers. There's always people with tobacco control that are going to need to read the study. even baseline studies and very background studies that may be very important at the regional level and could not be published in very high impact factor journals, even though TD has a 2.6 impact factor. TID welcomes such submissions because it's important to have grassroots baseline tobacco control that is really maybe be very important at a regional level. What else, and this is one of the main aspects, is the volume submissions. It's different when handling editors receive 5 manuscripts, and it's different when the handling editors receive 50 manuscripts. Because there we have to do some sort of triage, whether the manuscript should move to peer review or not. And then it's a sort of a comparison between the work that has been received. It's happened that, for instance, I remember this a few years ago, that for a few months it was very, very, very busy with manuscripts, and manuscripts were coming in, and then 2 or 3 months later it was very quiet. So a study that was submitted a few months ago was competing against another 50 studies, and then a study that was a few months later was competing only against 5 studies. And there's very different, of course, level of moving to peer review when there are only 5 studies in the inbox of the handling editors. Of course, relevance to readership is very important, and the best use of journal resources. A journal does not have unlimited resources. It may have unlimited pages if it's an online journal like such as TID, but unlimited pages does not mean unlimited resources. There still are people behind that are doing peer review, scientists doing peer review. There are typesetters typesetting. There are computer programmers making XML files. There are printers that are printing. There's web-based archiving. So there's a lot of resources that are used behind the scenes to be able to run a journal. So it's always taken into account what are the best use of journal resources. So the next session, the next part of the session, and it has 6 sections in this workshop, is we're going to be looking at one by one what are the different aspects of a manuscript. So this was what does an editor look for, and what are the main parts when you start, and what happens when your manuscript gets submitted to a journal. What is the first assessment? Now, what I'd like to do is then go and discuss and present what's the different sections and what to do in those different sections. Because people think that, I remember people, especially when one is more earlier career, for instance, a master's student level or PhD student level, it's their first manuscript or their first manuscripts, then it's very complex. It becomes very alarming. What is this? How do I write a manuscript? It's actually not very difficult if you follow the steps. It's like dancing. If you come, for instance, to Greece and you see the traditional dancing of Crete in Greece, it's a very complex footsteps. And I was wondering, how can one dance like that? But then when you learn what are the simple steps, it's a very easy, repeatable steps. I also remember coming to Thailand just before the pandemic for a conference in Bangkok, and I was listening at the dancing at the convention center. I had a presentation, and it looked very complex, the steps. But then after a while, I started realizing there's specific movements. Same thing with the manuscript. There's specific steps, specific movements that can make a manuscript easier to write. So I'm going to go to the next section on the introduction. But I'm going to open up my air conditioning because it's still summer in Greece and it's warm inside the house. So let me just open my air conditioning. I'll go to that. So the first section of the manuscript, and this is the first part, is the introduction, of course. Now, the introduction, the overall purpose of the introduction is really, as I would say, a quick introduction. And when we say an introduction, it should be short, concise, and it should be just that, an introduction. In the same way as if I was to come to and meet you, and you were to meet me, I would say, hello, my name is Constantine Vardavas, I do this, I do that, and I work there. That would be a 1-minute introduction. I wouldn't say what's my favorite ice cream, whether I like dogs or cats, or whether I prefer blue or green as a color. Those things are not in an introduction when I to introduce myself. An introduction is very straightforward. Hello, my name is this and this. I work like here and there, and I would like to talk about this and that. That's the introduction. So an introduction does not include what shows you watch on Netflix and all the rest. It's a very simple, straightforward introduction. Same thing with a manuscript. An introduction is short, it's concise, and it must convince the reader that your study will add knowledge and is somehow useful. So there's some steps, some aspects of an introduction. Now, in the initial planning for this conference with Dr. Agaku, we were discussing whether that usually this is around round tables, so we would have maybe some participants would sit around round table rotundas inside the conference venue, and it's a very interactive section where we'd be writing also on pieces of paper. So because it's all done via distance now, it's not going to be as interactive as this would be in person, but looking forward to the next APACT, and we can organize this in person for the next APACT. But for today, since it's virtual and it's a live streaming, they'll go through the points for the introduction. So another further purpose of the introduction is to stimulate the editors, who is the first person who's going to read it, the reviewers, the next people that are going to read it, and then the actual readers of the journal, their interest. If an introduction is interesting and it's like a trailer, think of it like the first few minutes of a movie. If the first few minutes of a movie or a TV series are interesting, then you're likely to watch the movie or the television show. If it's very boring, then you're more likely to just change the channel. So the same thing here. An introduction must be a bit interesting. So it provides background information about the study and states the research question, which is the most important part of the study. What is your research question, research hypothesis, which we'll talk about. So the content of the introduction is that it establishes the context, the setting of work being reported. An introduction should discuss relevant primary research literature and briefly explain the approach and outcomes very, very briefly. But the main point here I like to talk about is bullet point 2, discusses relevant primary research literature, which means an introduction of a manuscript adds some sections, it has to have a background of literature. But the main point here is that when you're writing an introduction, you want to include literature, so your reference list, maybe 5, 10, 15 studies. I'll use probably a gold number around 10 for the introduction. But the last thing that you'd want to do, and this is definitely a big no-no, is you don't have, for instance, 40 references or 30 references in the introduction. And the introduction is 3 pages long. An introduction which is 3 pages long and has 30 references, it shows automatically the handling editor that this is too in-depth for an introduction, which then starts ringing a bell. Maybe there's not, maybe the manuscript itself is going to be difficult to read. And again, it's all about making a manuscript easy to flow, easy to read, and that's how to get through the system. So the relevant research literature should be concise and just what is needed. Just the references needed to cover the topic. You don't have to do a systematic review in the introduction. For instance, say we're looking at the impact of secondhand smoke in communities in rural Thailand, which is a manuscript that went through the system of TID recently. What you want to do is you'd want to have, for instance, a few references on what is the context, the regional or the rural areas of Thailand, what are these community settings, one or two references about secondhand smoke. Everyone knows how bad secondhand smoke is. And then the gap. But you don't need to do a systematic review that secondhand smoke is related to bronchitis, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, etc. You don't have to do that. It's not related to the topic. The topic, for instance, is community intervention for secondhand smoke. Then you'd want to have it focused on that. You don't have to go into all the details about secondhand smoke, why it's bad, why it's good. 1 or 2 lines is enough. Just enough. So the outline of the introduction, it's important to identify the topic of the paper. So when you start off saying that, for instance, a cappella, exposure to secondhand smoke is an important issue for public health. Secondhand smoke is related to a plethora of diseases. However, you say that the problem is that in our country or in this country, there's a lack of knowledge on the extent of exposure to secondhand smoke in the community setting, in households. So that is the general problem. And then you have to point out what information is missing. However, there is limited information on what is the extent of exposure to secondhand smoke, for instance, in Thailand or Malaysia or Southeast Asia. So that's just a sort of how you just assess it. And in general, if you get a manuscript, it's also good to be able, when you're reading a manuscript, to be able to identify what's the general problem, where's the problem statements, where's the literature behind that, and what is missing. That's also, I'd underline the word here, missing. So what information is missing? And so an introduction has what's the problem, what's the gap, and what's the knowledge, what's the gap in the knowledge, and how are you going to address this gap. So an introduction gives relevant limitations of previous studies. So for instance, the gap may be that other studies have limitations, such as, for instance, the last study that assessed secondhand smoke in a country was done 5 years ago, or before a smoke-free legislation, or before plain packaging, or before graphic warning labels were implemented. So that's a limitation of a previous study, which then shows why your study is more important and better. So to be very clear on how filling the gap will be useful. Then at the last part of the introduction is the study purpose and hypothesis. So you have the information about secondhand smoke, you have a gap, that is a lack of information on what's the level of exposure to secondhand smoke in the population, and your study purpose then is missing, and that's the last point. Now the study purpose is, for instance, however, the aim of our study then is to assess to what extent families in, for instance, in Thailand are exposed to secondhand smoke from the parents. For instance, how children are exposed to smoke from their parents. So that's the study purpose. And the hypothesis would be, and our hypothesis is that the younger children, for instance, are more exposed, or girls are more exposed than boys, things like that. Just quick definition. So when you have the problem statement, and we have the baseline information, and we have the problem statement, what we want to know is the general problem of interest. Is saying that it's interesting. Is the problem indeed a problem, or is it just a simple gap in the literature? Why is the problem important? You can give numbers or rates or costs. For instance, if you're looking at exposure to secondhand smoke, you can provide a reference saying that previous research has indicated that, 45% of children in this setting are exposed to secondhand smoke. That's a number, 45%. Or smoking is costing the economy $10 billion per year, for instance. Those are costs and those are prevalences, or those are baseline numbers that indeed indicate the significance of a problem. And then, of course, you have to be very clear about when you have this gap, this problem statement, what are the populations? Are they adults? Are they children? Are they pregnant women? Are they blue-collar employees? Are they doctors? Are they nurses? Are they midwives? You have to be very clear what are the specific populations in the problem statement. So if you to try and sort of like add them together, you can have in a problem statement, what's the problem? What's the impact of this problem? Is it a high percentage? Is it a bad rate? Is it that people if you have an increase in, for instance, no tobacco uptake? And what are specific populations? So it's more, think of the classical who, when, what questions. So what are the specific populations involved? Now, background information is also very important. So what are the results of previous studies on this topic in the introduction? Are there areas of uncertainty? For instance, in COVID-19, especially in the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, the introductions of manuscripts related to COVID-19 and tobacco were always, there's a difference in information whether smoking is a risk factor or not of COVID-19. Of course, there were many factors behind some of the published work that was released, but we'll talk about that, I think, tomorrow in tomorrow morning's session. I think Stan Glantz is also tomorrow morning in that session as well. So it should be a very interesting one. So areas of disagreement or uncertainty, other factors that could affect study design, and other information that gives context. So if we're talking about a regional information, such as what's happening, for instance, in Greece, now that we're going to hopefully soon implement plain packaging. That's good to know. Then we say, okay, we're going to implement plain packaging in the next few years. Then it's important to note that if we're looking at a study talking about, for instance, the impact of information or tobacco packs on consumer information, smoke information, or smoking cessation, it gives some context to the information. So when you're starting off with the literature, you move from the general problem, secondhand smoke is detrimental to human health, okay, we know that, everyone knows that, to the more specific problem. And the problem may be that children are exposed to secondhand smoke in our region or in the country of interest. So you're going from a general problem to a specific problem, and that's how you move. And you highlight the previous literature, and by putting references, and again, remember, 10 references is about right. Maybe 15, but not more than 15 ever in an introduction. Should be short. So the literature review within the introduction should provide a review or assessment of the current knowledge, but not a systematic review and not a literature review that is too detailed. You don't need to have 3 pages of introduction to show that secondhand smoke is bad. You need 1 paragraph. So think of it like that. There's 1 paragraph. The studies should be representative, in other words, of what is in the literature or a few key studies, but you don't need to reference every single study. You'd reference studies that are more relevant. And then, if possible, within the literature review, especially for studies that are more qualitative and have focus groups, it's always very good, or you have an intervention, or you want to do behavioral change, then it's always good to provide a theoretical framework behind that. What's the theory behind this approach that you're going to follow? And this may be especially important for studies, again, that are more qualitative, where you need to have a theory behind it. And one of the last sections in an introduction is the study purpose and hypothesis. So we state the study purpose and the hypothesis that has to be tested. We provide a clear description of what this study hopes to accomplish. And that may be, for instance, the purpose of this study. You can always start off like that. That's why it's very useful to read other manuscripts before you're writing or as you're writing your own, no matter how experienced you are. So I think I've written about 250 manuscripts in PubMed at the moment, and still, after 250 manuscripts, I always would read other manuscripts to think about it, get ideas, see how to read it, see what wording people are using, and then you can adapt it to your own style. So you'd say, the purpose of this study is to explore the role of X, Y, and Z. And then we hypothesize that, blah, blah, blah. So this is the last paragraph of the introduction. It has the study purpose and the hypothesis as well. So for instance, this is an example. So as you can see in a, this is from our class that we do, that we have the National Survey on Children's Health, which is a national representative study of so many children to address, one, so these are our research questions, the extent of insurance, 2, social, demographic, and health factors associated with underinsurance, and 3, association between underinsurance and actors of quality of care. So this is just an idea of what you have. You have what you're going to address and what are your research questions, 1, 2, 3 research questions. So common mistakes in the introduction is that information is too simple, or the information is too detailed. Again, it's a matter of learning the process that information should be not too simple, but not too complex. It has to be, think about it somewhere in the beginning. And one of the big mistake that's very common is that you understate the importance, or someone understates the importance of the research question. The research question is going to be important that you're bringing forward, and you've got to sell it as an important topic. You can't simply have it and say, we will look at that. Well, you've got to prove the importance. Of course, some other mistakes is that, as I said, many references or results given at the end of an introduction section, so people are already putting introduction. So, covered that. Yeah. So additional tips is that introduction should be about 10% of the total word count. And this is your opportunity to sell your paper. So you have this opportunity to sell your paper during the introduction, because that is read with the abstract first. I guess I'm still being heard and still being followed. That's the big difference with the in person. I can't see the audience, so I can't get any feedback from the audience. And we're just about into the 45 minutes into the session, so I don't know whether we're okay, and I'll just continue. But I'll go into my next point about how to write a paper, the method section. So the purpose of the method section in a manuscript is to assess really the quality of the approach of the study, the validity of the conclusions, because in the method section you describe how the data is collected, how the data is organized, and how the data is analyzed. And this allows for a meaningful interpretation of the results. And why a method section should be detailed enough is that if a method section is detailed enough, a colleague should be able to read your methods and reproduce the study. So by reading the method section of your manuscript, one should be able to redo the same type of research. So you must have all the detail there that's needed to be able to someone to redo your study, which is good. So for instance, if it's a population-based study, they'd want to see which population, when, where, how, what questions. Again, in some points, you don't have to go into too much detail. We see this often, that someone starts describing the questionnaire. The questionnaire had 5 sections, one section demographic, one section on this, one section on that, another section on this. It's not too informative. If, though, the questionnaire uses tools, recognized tools, it may be the GYTS data questionnaire for children, it may be GATS questionnaire from WHO and CDC, it may be a tool for smoking cessation and things like that. So that's what maybe one of the points I get. Oh, there is a chat. Okay. So the components of the methodology section. The methodology section should cover, first of all, the study design, study settings, the different types of variables that are included. So the type of information is collected during the questionnaire or during the intervention. What are the sensitivity analysis, which we'll talk very shortly about that, and the statistical analysis. And one point which is missing from here is the the ethics in this the ethics inside the study. So I was reading the chat. This information. Yeah. So tobacco use diseases (TID) is indexed in PubMed, in Scopus, in Embase, in Web of Science. It has an impact factor of 2.6. So just feel there was a question popped up on the chat. So yes, it's indexed in PubMed, Scopus, Embase. It has an impact of Web of Science and has an impact factor of 2.6 this year. And next year we probably assume that it should have an impact factor of maybe 3.5 or so. So let's go to the methodology section. And first thing is the study setting and design. We must describe the person, the place, and the time. For instance, we have a study that is performed. The place, is it, for instance, this is in the US, is it local, state, or is it national? Which country is the place? The person, what is the target and sample population? We want to know really where the study was done, who the study collected information from, when the study was done. So where, who, when, the time. In other words, was it performed in 2017? Was it performed in 2021? Or was it performed in the summer months of 2021? And the study design and sample size is important. So this is a very important slide, I think, for the methods, because this really shows the first part of the first paragraph of the methods. It should show the study design, the place, the people, and the time. So an example would be in this case, we performed a cross-sectional study, that's the study design, among 2,000 residents, sample size, and people target, sample population, in Thailand. So there's a place. In 2021, there's a time. So within one sentence, I said the study design, the sample size, the place, and the time. That automatically gives the reader a picture of what is the what you're looking at with regards to the methods of the manuscript. Of course, there are very different levels of evidence between a basic case report, case study, cross-sectional, case control, etc., etc., etc. So there are many different levels of different types of studies here that one can present. But usually, most of the studies that are published in journals in the field are cross-sectional studies, case control studies, and cohort studies. These three, the middle three, are the most usual types of studies that are identified. Of course, randomized trials, meta-analysis also appear, and some case studies, not so much case reports. So most studies are either cross-sectional, cohort, or case control. So what's included in the study setting and design paragraph, which is the first paragraph of the methods, the information on the target population, how the sample population was selected from the target population. They're two different things. Now, a target population could be, we're interested in knowing the impact of secondhand smoke among children in a country. Now, the sample population are those that were sampled, because you can't get everyone from, for instance, the whole of Greece, or the whole of Italy, or the whole of Thailand, or Malaysia, or China to respond to a questionnaire. It's impossible. What you want to do is you have a sample. So people that are purposely selected to be able to respond to your questionnaire. So how are these people selected? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? For instance, inclusion criteria they must be above 18, they must have given written informed consent, etc., etc. What about missing values? Do we have a lot of missing values or response rates? And if there's information on ethics, and this is absolutely important, because it's very good when you write a manuscript to have a specific few lines on ethics. It's absolutely important. It's a very big checkbox, a tick box that editors have. Does the study meet all ethical requirements? Has the study got ethical approval? Was written informed consent collected? Is there a protocol number? For instance, it's also always very helpful in the study to write the ethics protocol number, because then one can always double check, and if someone says, oh, the study was performed or not performed properly, you can always then refer to the ethics committee. So it's important to have the ethics committee's protocol number, for instance. So the study setting and design, an example. This is a first paragraph of a methods. So for instance, we have here, we use data from a representative cohort study, so there's your design, people among US adults, and the place is US households, and the time here was between April, June 2014 and September, November 2014. So in one paragraph, you want to include these four things: study design, the people, the place, and the time. You should always start your method section with this paragraph. What's the study design? What are the people? What's the place? And what's the time? Now, when you have outcomes, without going into too much detail, because this slide has a lot of information, you want to assess what are your primary outcomes. So, for instance, if you look at successful smoking cessation, you want to see how you're defining smoking cessation. Is it smoking abstinence? Are you measuring carbon monoxide? Is your primary outcome exposure to secondhand smoke? So how are you measuring this exposure? Is it PM 2.5 in indoor air? Is it self-reported exposure? Is it saliva or blood or urine protein? Is it nicotine? What is your outcome? So there's always a primary outcome from a study, and usually there's a secondary outcome as well. So you may have that you're looking, for instance, at exposure to secondhand smoke, but another outcome may be experimentation or with tobacco products in the family. That may be a secondary outcome. And then how are you measuring these outcomes? So if you're measuring secondhand smoke exposure, again, how is it? Is it question self-reported? Is it airborne measured? Is it human substance measured? Things like that. And so you must have, think of the methods, it has this one paragraph of the gap. It has what are your primary outcomes and how you're measuring your primary outcomes. What was the approach that was followed inside the methods? It's good to be able to describe the approach. Have a third paragraph on, or third section of the methods on the ethics of the study. And then the last section inside the methods is the statistical analysis section. It's very important to keep this flow and keep this description, because it helps the readers and the editors and also the reviewers walk through your manuscript very easily. If they know that they're going to see the statistics at the end of your method, it helps them when they're reading through the manuscript to identify where and how, what approaches were used. So you should note the statistical software used for the analysis, the variables and confounders assessed and included in the analysis. If you're using, for instance, different types of statistics, now remember, it's good to start off with your basic statistics. So, and without this becoming a statistics course or presentation, you start off with your bivariate analysis, so your univariate, your bivariate analysis, and then you go into more complex models. So you don't immediately start presenting that we ran a logistic regression analysis. Okay, you ran a logistic regression analysis, that's great, but you also did something before that. You did univariate, did you do chi-square tests, did you do student t-tests, and then did you do correlations? Did you look at Pearson correlations? Did you look then at multivariable models, etc., etc.? So, and there are also other aspects, but again, I don't think it's in today the context of today's presentation. And I said usually this session is an interactive session with roundtables, but I think in light of the pandemic, it still is informative, even as a monologue at the moment. So, common errors to avoid in the methods. Writing numbers 1 to 10 is a number. Okay, I think I can skip these because this is more general. And I think the next point, of course, is the results section. So the results section of the manuscript. Let me just have my sip of coffee. It's now 7 o'clock in the morning, so good morning from Greece. If at some point my kids walk into the screen, it's just because they're waking up to get ready for school. So you may see a child pass by behind me. Just my children. So, how to write a paper? The results section. Now, the results section is a relatively easy section to write in a manuscript because a lot of work has already gone into preparing the results before you even start writing. Because you know the methods, because the method is what you've been doing and following for the past 1 year, 2 years in preparation of collecting data. And this data has then been analyzed and you have the results. So you usually start off the results section with the tables, not in the text, but to write your results section, you need to talk to your statistician or your biostatistician has helped you in the analysis, and then you have your tables. So before you write a manuscript, you have in front of you printed in paper or on the screen, it's very helpful, the tables of the manuscript. When you have the tables of the manuscript, then it's much easier to actually write the results. So the goals of the results section is to present the who and what was found, but it's not to present the how we found the data, so no methods, and definitely, again, this is a major point, definitely no discussion of the results. So when you're presenting the results, think of it as presenting as boring as possible. You want the reader to read it very boringly, the results. So you don't need to add in words such as, we interestingly noted that, secondhand smoke was, exposure was higher among 5 to 6 year olds. It's not interesting. It is interesting, of course, but you don't use the word interesting. You must present it very blank. Think of it the way you'd want to bring forward in a very simple, boring way. So you'd say that the highest number of the population with the highest exposure were 5 to 6 year olds. Full stop. You don't need to write interestingly, surprisingly, amazingly. No such words. It's very straightforward. A, B, C. You just show the data and you communicate the information in a very logical, boring way. That's the safest way to write the results. You don't have to go on to do any fancy wordsmithing or fancy writing. Leave the fancy writing for the discussion, where you can show your talent in writing. The results is A, B, C. So what is this A, B, C? As you said, first, what do you do? And this is, again, I would screenshot this slide. First, you must ensure that you have the table shells, the figures and the graphs ready before you write. To write the results, you need your tables. So what you do is you have your table shells, you know what you're going to do, what you're going to analyze. Then, of course, you either do the analysis yourself if you've got the experience, or you talk to a biostatistician to help you with the analysis. It's always correct to ask a biostatistician for the help, always. Having a biostatistician have a look at your results, even if someone is very competent and very good in analysis. I regard myself as very good in analysis. I still would ask a biostatistician to have a double look, because we may have studied or learned to do the analysis very well. You may have a degree that has some components of biostatistics in there, it's always good to have a statistician give a double check. Doesn't harm. So the analysis, as I said, also in the methods, it's the descriptive, univariate, students t-test, chi-square tests, and then you go to more complex models. So, and additional analysis you think about along the way, and sensitivity analysis later on. So it must go from simple to very complex. The same way in a movie, you'd want the movie to build up. So if you're watching a television show, if they kill the main character within 5 minutes, and then the movie is very slow afterwards, it's a boring movie. But then if think of the opposite, that you have a main character and they're going to, and it's an action movie and they're moving ahead and it's becoming more and more complex, more explosions, more cars, more fast cars running or whatever you want to see. So things are building up, and then, for instance, the hero dies at the end. Okay, that's building up the crescendo to from a descriptive to a multivariable. You don't start with multivariable and go descriptive. So it's descriptive, multivariable. So you fill in the tables, figures, graphs, and then you just double check again. This is where you double check what you thought of as your research hypothesis. Is this actually being analyzed? Because sometimes you end up, and this is common, it happens, that you have a research hypothesis and you're starting with a research hypothesis. For instance, we were doing a study that was looking at, this was just before the pandemic, what's the cost effectiveness for masks to prevent transmissible diseases. And we had respiratory diseases, and we had a few other types. Of course, when COVID pandemic hit, then initially you've got your analysis, and we just focused only on the respiratory diseases because that was a hot topic. Same thing here. You may have a lot of data, but you don't need to present all your data in a manuscript. Of course, you don't want multiple salami paper manuscripts, but you may want to have a specific research question that pops up, which is more interesting than your initial one, because the results you're finding are very surprising. So you want to make sure that if you're changing slightly what you're going to present, that you also adapt your research question and double check that these two are matching. So for the participants and the result, it's good to describe descriptive information of the participants. But then again, when you're describing the basic information, if the information is written in the table, then you can just highlight 1 or 2 points. You do not want to repeat all the information that's in the table in the text. So if you have a table that has the descriptive information and demographics of the participants, age, gender, religion, income, rural versus urban, married versus unmarried, etc., etc. You don't need to go and present in writing every single line of the table. You want to say that, for instance, the demographic information of the study participants are presented in table 1, and then you can have highlights, for instance, of which 54% were female, and predominantly of higher education level, full stop. You don't need to go and describe that how much so many percent had this income, so many percent had that income, so many percent were unemployed, so many percent were employed, because you can see that in the table. So you give some very basic descriptive information. And then when you're answering your research question, you have your basic unadjusted analysis, which is your bivariate analysis. Then you have your adjusted analysis, which is your multivariable analysis, your regression analysis, and then any sensitivity analysis that you perform at the end of that section. So you write about the significant results. You don't write all the results. It's important to be precise when you report the statistical significance in a study. This is something that is a very common error that pops up in preparing a manuscript for a peer-reviewed journal, or when a handling editor is reading a manuscript and someone says, for instance, we found a significant association between age and younger age and higher exposure to secondhand smoke. P equals to 0.07. But p0.07 is not smaller than p0.05. So while the writing says that we had a significant, the p-value is not statistically significant. So we could be very precise. If something is not statistically significant, don't call it significant. Of course, it can be significant per se, but don't write it as such, because the reader gets confused that, wait, looking at the manuscript, the p-value is higher than 0.5, or the difference is too small, the 95% confidence intervals overlap the 1, so that shows that the study is that's not statistically different. So you've got to take that into account. Again, don't repeat the information, the figures and tables. Keep the text and tables in the same order. So you don't start off as seen the demographics in table 2, and then you go down the multivariable analysis in table 1. It doesn't go like that. It must go table 1, table 2. And again, just double check, because it's a very common mistake. I make the mistake also quite often, is that look for consistency in the tables and the text. So if the numbers are copy pasted correctly, so if it is 54.6%, then you write 54.6% also in the text. And talking about also percentages, usually it's good to round off to the first decimal point, 54.6%. You don't have to have 54.61% or 54.62%. It's 54.6%. One decimal point is sufficient for a results section. So in the results, you report the facts. There's no interpretation. So don't have to interpret or discuss the results. You're just presenting the results. You have a precise and consistent language. So you use very clean, plain language when writing the results. You report all the findings, even if they don't completely support your hypothesis, because they may be showing something else happening. And you report primarily the research question of your introduction. So if you're talking about exposure to secondhand smoke in your study, in a population-based study, then you wouldn't want to include also, for instance, experimentation with other tobacco products, or whether there's the last type of smoking cessation method used inside the house. That may not be directly relevant to your research question. So this is very important, and this is also something I'd recommend for very further reading. There are specific standards for writing types of studies. And these standards, these reporting standards, they help organize the outline and structure of each section of a manuscript. And for instance, the Equator Network has standards for reporting. So you choose this URL, www.equatornetwork.org. And this site also will be very helpful, because it has a good number of approaches that you could use when you're writing not only the methods or the results section, but the entire manuscript. So a lot of studies are observational studies, which means the studies that do not have an intervention, where it's not a randomized study or an intervention pre-post study. These are observational studies, cross-sectional, for instance, or cohort studies, which you're not intervening, but you're observing the participants from EPI. So in the participants in the results section, and why am I presenting this? Because this is the most common approach. The most common approach and the most common time is that report the number of individuals at each stage of the study, how many were eligible, how many were included, how many were followed up for the cohort study. It's very useful to have a flow diagram of popular participants, especially if you have something that is more complex. You can have a flow diagram, people came in, people dropping out, things like that. You give characteristics of the participants, demographics, clinical, social, educational, and you give descriptive information on the exposures and potential confounders. You provide information on participants with missing data, and you can follow up and present also follow-up time if you have a cohort study, just as an idea of what things you'd include in the descriptive part of the results section. Main result is very important. You give your unadjusted estimate. If you're doing a more complex regression analysis, you first give your unadjusted estimates, and then your confound adjusted estimates and the precision, the confidence intervals afterwards. So you'd have your crude odds are, and then your adjusted odds are with its 95% confidence intervals later on in the results. So remember, descriptive, crude regression analysis, and then more confound adjusted regression analysis afterwards. And I think the rest is very more complex and not within the for today. So common mistakes. A very common mistake here is the when we have borderline significance and then we are interpreting it as significant. So a common mistake is that you have reporting results that are not statistically significant. It doesn't mean it's bad to have results that are not statistically significant. It's okay to have results that are not statistically significant, but we shouldn't be reporting them as such. Another mistake that's very common is having exactly the same information in the text, the tables, and the figures. If something is in the text, it does not need a figure. If something is all presented in the table, it does not all need to be presented in writing. So think about saving being repetitive. Another common mistake is that the numbers in the tables and the numbers in the text, they don't match, which is very common. I actually did it myself in a manuscript a few months ago that I submitted to a journal. But I just double checked afterwards, and indeed I copied wrong the numbers from the table into the text. So it's very frequently happens. The text and tables don't match. Another common mistake is only reporting the data that support your hypothesis. Of course, when you're doing a study, you have other information that pops up that is relevant or may not support your hypothesis. You must also report that data. So that's another interesting point. So, and then the last section of a manuscript is the discussion section. So you have the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. Now the discussion section is usually the last thing to write in a manuscript, because here you need to have a good idea of the introduction. What was the introduction? A good idea of the methods, a good idea of the results. You must have presented the results, and then here in the discussion you are discussing the results. You're giving a presentation of the results in a more elaborate format. So the overall purpose of the discussion section is to explain the meaning of the results to the readers and why these results are important. You know, why care? Why is this study important? That's one of the main points of the discussion. So further purposes is that the discussion should answer the questions that you've written in the introduction and explain how the answers fit in with the existing knowledge of the introduction. And inside the discussion, the author can express his or her opinion or positions. Not always is it necessary, but you can do that. So think of that the introduction is the beginning and the discussion is the end, and they must match. So by reading the introduction, you should respond to that inside the discussion. So it's like the beginning and the end. So what you do in the discussion is you do an additional commentary on your study. In other words, what did the study show? What might this mean? How can you interpret this? Why does it happen? What are alternative explanations for these findings? You want to identify, for instance, whether your study has identified something new. Is it different from what has been previously presented? If we're finding, for instance, a very high level of exposure to secondhand smoke at the community level, we want to interpret that. Again, though, careful when interpreting, because you need to interpret, but you don't want to over-interpret. But we'll talk about that in a little while. So the main outline, and this for me is a screenshot outline of a discussion section. The first paragraph should summarize major findings of the study. The next paragraph should present secondary results or discuss about secondary results. The third section of the discussion should show how these results compare with prior knowledge. What did other studies show on this topic? And then what these results or the results that you presented actually mean. Now, just before the end of the discussion, you have a strengths and limitations paragraph. It's always important, and sometimes it's forgotten, but is it checked? It's always a tick box, and also included it's a tick box. Does the study include a limitations and strengths section? So you want to note your limitations and strengths of the study. And then the last paragraph is your conclusions. It can be conclusions and implications or just conclusions. So, one of the main points of a discussion is the first paragraph. Now, this is where we say we summarize major findings in the first paragraph. Now, what is the first paragraph? Now, say you're going to meet the Minister of Health of your country, or you're going to meet this famous professor that you want to work with. Think of this paragraph as that 1 minute, as we say, elevator pitch. You're in the elevator with this person. It may be Minister of Health, it may be a person you're interested in, it may be a highly valued professor that you want to collaborate with in the future. You have that 1 minute to make a good impression and to convey your message. That is what you'd write in the first paragraph of that discussion. So, for instance, in the same way that you wouldn't say in that 1 minute part of the in the elevator, hello, I like dogs, I like mango ice cream, and I like traveling. You want to go straight forward and say, we've done a study, and in our cross-section study in, for instance, in Thailand 2021, we identified that 45% of children were exposed to secondhand smoke, and and the highest exposure was among the 5 to 7 year old females. That is your take-home point. So you'd say that in major findings. You wouldn't go and talk about all the different demographics, those who are unemployed, employed, blah, 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 blah. You want to go to your main point. So you have, think of it as about this much, 5 lines, the major findings. And again, it's a 1 minute pitch, we say, the 1 minute talk. Those is the first paragraph. So this is an example. So here, using the 2007 National Survey of Children's Health data, we found that almost 1/4 of children with continuing insurance were inadequately covered or uninsured. So for instance, that was a major one finding. Think of it like the newspaper heading that you want to have, or what you want to put on Twitter, for instance. So after the main paragraph, you have a secondary paragraph. The secondary paragraph are the secondary results, which you discuss the most significant secondary results after you've discussed the prime results. So for instance, if that first paragraph had your one take-home message, the next paragraph can have secondary information, which is important, but not at the same level. It's like a newspaper. It's the front page of the newspaper, and then it's the rest of the pages. In the secondary results, you synthesize and summarize. You don't just repeat what you've already found and already written in the results. The reader does not want to read for the second time the same thing. So you want to change your writing, change your approach, interpret, summarize. You don't want one by one to present again all the results. And you don't need to discuss results that are common knowledge. So if something is very well known, I don't need to discuss it in the discussion. Discuss those things that are more interesting or more novel or things like that. And the third part of the discussion is, how does your results compare with prior knowledge? Because everyone does a study and it bases it on previous knowledge and adds, as I said, a small brick to the wall of knowledge. So you need, in the next paragraphs, plural, few paragraphs of your discussion to compare your results, your primary findings and your secondary findings with other studies. So how does your study expand on previous ones? What does your study add? Where are the differences? Is it because it's a different setting? Did you find a high exposure, low exposure, a better intervention, a worse intervention? You can do your comparison with other studies. But again, you do not need to compare with every single study in the entire literature. You could go on and write a thesis. Remember, a paper, a manuscript, is not a master's thesis and it's not a PhD thesis. It is a 3,000 word document, which is a very short 10-page, 8 to 10-page document. It doesn't have to be longer. So you don't review the entire literature, you review some of the good ones or some that are directly relevant. So if there's been a previous study that's been done, for instance, in your setting, how do your results compare to a previous study? A common mistake that happens here is that people compare or authors compare their study with settings that are completely different. For instance, it's not relevant to have a study that is performed in rural Greece, in an island on Greece, and say that we have 66%, 67% actually, of our participants had exposure to secondhand smoke. You don't compare that to something that is completely different. So I wouldn't compare that to exposure to secondhand smoke in Thailand or Australia or the US. It's very different. You may compare it to another region of Greece, for instance. That would be more logical. Or another region of Southeastern Europe. Or if it was in Thailand, you compare it with Southeastern Asia. You wouldn't compare, for instance, Thailand with a study in Italy. There's not really much of a comparison. So you compare with prior knowledge that's relevant to your setting. If your results disagree with what others have been finding, you have to explain why. It could be because you have a very different study design, because of the study participants, which is an inherent issue because they're not the same people in the study. A study that's done, for instance, in Crete, the island of Crete in Greece, is going to be different from a study that's done in another island or another city, or a study that's done in Thailand is going to be different. The participants from participants in the study in Greece. So the characteristics may be different, the design may be different, but also it will be the way the measurements were made, because measurements could be different. So they are you'd want to show where and how your study compares. But do not be overcritical of previous studies. So in the discussion section, say, for instance, we found our study in our setting to have a 60% or 50% exposure to secondhand smoke. However, this is different to the study of the previous author, who did not do this, who did not do that, who did not do this, and who did not do that. You don't want to be critical of previous studies. You want to be gentle but factual. Now, keep to the facts. And also keep into point the bullet point here that says that the authors of that previous study may be assigned to review your study. So you want to be polite. Think of when you're writing inside a discussion, you want to write in a tone and a way that you would like people to write about you as well. So if you're overcritical, it's not always as polite. So you just be to the facts, and you don't have to go into any polemics and things like that in discussion. Another area which is sometimes noted is that you don't have to be polemic. It's not good to be polemic in a manuscript. You can be polemic in a newspaper article and very aggressive, but an academic manuscript is more polite. It can be very, very straightforward and bluntly on some points, but there should be facts. It would be inappropriate to write, for instance, that this study was performed by Vardavas et al. It's very different results because he did not know what he was writing, or did not know what he was doing, or he made mistakes. You don't write that in the manuscript. You could say that our results are different from the study of Vardavas, as our approach was X, while his approach was Z. You don't have to go into too much detail saying that, oh, he was good, he was bad, he was whatever. To the facts. Don't write a paragraph about each of the studies, or previous studies, but write an overview, like there may be one or two important studies. You don't need to talk about every single study in your study setting, in your country, in your region that looked at, for instance, secondhand smoke. And I'm using secondhand smoke as an example because it's a very common topic that people work on, secondhand smoke exposure. And it's a very one that everyone understands. That's why I use that as an example. So you want in your discussion to show what the results mean. You want to interpret the results and indicate they're important. And you want to discuss, and this is an important point, clinical versus statistical significance. And when we say clinical significance, it also means population significance, because you may find that a study has a statistically significant difference, but it doesn't have any interpretation or any meaning. For instance, if you have a very large sample size, a very big sample size, it's more likely to have a statistical significance because the p-value depends on sample size. So if you have a very big study, 10,000 participants, you may find more statistically significant results. But for instance, a statistical significant difference that, girls were more exposed than boys to secondhand smoke, and it's 55% versus 53%. That's statistically significant if you have a very large sample size, but does not mean that it has population significance. Is there a difference between 53% of people being exposed and 56% of people being exposed? I wouldn't say so. It's a very small percentage. From a research percentage, from a public health perspective, it's different, but from a manuscript perspective, it's the clinical. Same thing is that we have very often with, for instance, a lot of studies that are looking at e-cigarettes or novel tobacco products or heated tobacco products or water pipe, where they say we identified that this product was 54% higher. Good morning. Family's woken up slowly. So you're telling your readers why your results matter, and the interpretation of the results is a large part of the discussion. You can consider all the implications of the results, the clinical, the biological, the methods, the ethical, and what the results mean. What you want to do is you indicate the strength of your study and how certain are you. These findings demonstrate that, for instance, X can lead to Y, so you want to be able to interpret very clearly your results. And the next point, of course, in the discussion section is the strengths and limitations. Now, the limitations, it's very important to write limitations in a study because it forces you to do a peer review of your own work. It critiques your work. It gives you a clear indication of your weaknesses. Now, I remember in the past, it was always, oh, what should we do? Should I be writing the limitations of my own study in my manuscript? Aren't I shooting myself in the foot? The answer is no. If you're writing your limitations in the study, and it is very good to write your limitations in the study, you can actually show that you understand where your weaknesses are, and by showing where your weaknesses are and acknowledging your weaknesses, you're telling the author, the readers, that this is you're showing the readers what points should take into account and what aspects should be acknowledged as limitations in there. You want to press, okay, I'm going to mute for one split second. Where do I mute? Okay, so thank you. So a clear assessment of weaknesses can show the reader that you're an objective scientist and you understand the research, you understand the limitations, and you present your potential biases, a small sample size if you have a small sample size in your study, a fact that your study you may have a small response rate, an important limitation is if it's a cross-sectional study, you can't attribute causality, and things like that. So those things you put into your limitations. And if you can't think of any limitations, you ask yourself, if I could do the study over, what changes would I make? Was the design rigorous? Were the subjects appropriate? Was the measurements precise and valid? Was the follow-up complete? And a priori, when you have limitations by study design, there are going to be always limitations. For instance, a cross-sectional study always has aspects of causality. A cohort study may have aspects of follow-up, of missing loss to follow-up. So these are inherent limitations in each study. So even if you can't think of any limitations, if you read a bit the literature or look at the limitations of your study design, you can identify some. You want to consider and bring all potential limitations from study design to study interpretation. But you also, it's important to be concentrate on how you've also interpreted the results and not just look at limitations of sample size and things like that. But having the limitations section of the study is not bad, it's actually good, because it shows that you understand the limitations of your study and you know what up to where can you push the limits of your study. Possible limitations, and this is again another screenshot. The sample size may be too small, so you're underpowered. The causality may be not established by study design. Data may be collected retrospectively. Data may be self-reported. There may be different methods of measuring the outcome variable. We may be missing potentially important covariates, and the study sample may not be representative of the larger population. So these are examples of limitations that you may use in a study. Of course, it's also good when you have your limitations to show your study strengths, and you can often mention the study strengths and unique features right after the limitations, or just before the limitations. My personal opinion is usually I write the limitations and then I write the strengths. So, for instance, we have a cross-sectional study, which means we cannot attribute causality, because by design you cannot attribute causality in a cross-sectional study. However, our study was novel because it's never been done before in the study setting, because we used a very good follow-up, etc., etc., etc. Now, the last part of the manuscript is the conclusions and implications, the last paragraph, and this is your take-home message. You may have a speculation on the impact of your study findings and what it may have on clinical practice and current research. So this is a conclusion. But remember, when writing a conclusion, you take a position and you bring forward your position, but you don't want to be over-ambitious in your conclusions. For instance, you want to find a very specific point so you want to have specific recommendations, very straightforward specific recommendations. You can have some final concluding comments, but one of the main issues and one of the main problems that often pops up in the conclusion section, you do not just end by saying that additional research is needed. I used to do that as well. It's not a very good way to end a manuscript that additional research is needed, unless indeed additional research is needed, because it's very grade zone. You should never end the study by repeating the results for the third time, because you did once the results, again the discussion, and now the conclusions. You don't need to. And for me, the biggest, and for I guess most editors, the most biggest fatal result is I would say presenting conclusions that do not stem from results. And they use this also often in specific sting operations as well, where they bring forward and see whether the editors are doing a good job or peer review is working successfully. is that your conclusions must stem from the results. So if you're doing a population-based study that's looking at exposure to secondhand smoke in a community setting, then it's logical that your conclusions would be about exposure to secondhand smoke in a community setting. You can't have conclusions that say that, okay, then we need to stop the experimentation with no tobacco products or e-cigarettes, or we need to implement a randomized controlled trial of smoking cessation. Those things don't stem from the results. Or, as I say, you don't cure cancer and you don't save global warming and have global peace in the conclusion section. The conclusion section should stem only from the results of your manuscript. It should never cure global war, peace, and global warming. Those things we leave for other topics. I think I've covered this. I've covered all this. Okay. And I think in my last few minutes, I'll just want to go through 5 more slides on the abstract, because people, authors, often regard the abstract as the last thing that, oh, let's just write an abstract and submit. But actually, the abstract is like a trailer of the movie. If the trailer of the movie is interesting, you're more likely to watch the movie. But if a trailer is boring and you're zapping through the trailers, then you say, I don't want to watch the television, and change the channel or change the movie. But if the trailer is interesting, then you're more compelled to watch the movie. Same thing with the abstract. If the abstract is interesting, then you're compelled to watch and read the manuscript. So you write the abstract once you have completed the manuscript, but before you've written the title. Title is right at the end. And you should provide a short, accurate, and complete overview of the study in the abstract. And it should give interest to the readers for them to read then the full text of the article, and then of course cite you in the future. And make sure you read and follow the instructions of the authors very carefully. Common structures: you may have unstructured abstracts, which is just a paragraph, or you may have a abstract that has a background, methods, results, conclusions. You may also have a type of abstract that has objective setting, outcome, methods, results, conclusions. So you check for the journal that you're submitting to, and based on the journal you're submitting to, you write an appropriate abstract. The abstract, in other words, is journal specific. Some want a background, some want objective in settings, things like that. Keep care of the word count. Usually it's between 250 and 350 words. Each journal has its own separate, different word count for the abstract. So you've got to be careful about that. The abstract should cover 6 points. Why the study is important, what is the research question, who participated in the study, what's the study design and the analytical methods, what were the key findings, and what do they mean. These are the 6 bullet points that you want to cover in an abstract. A correct abstract has these 6 bullet points. So in the first part about the background, objective, introduction, it's only 2 lines. You want to write in 1 line what is already known, and in 1 or 2 lines what is the gap you come to cover. So this is 2 lines, the first 2 lines of the abstract. The next 2 to 3 lines of the abstract are the methods, where you want to write again. Remember, the who, the where, the when, and the how. So it's the year the data is collected, the sampling, how many participants, what outcomes were measured, the study design, and what type of statistics were used. You want to include that information in the abstract. The results, you want to focus only on your key significant findings. It's not appropriate to write inside an abstract that we found that 54% of the population was unemployed, or that most of the study participants were 18 to 24-year-olds. What we're interested in are the key findings. That, for instance, those who were exposed to secondhand smoke had a 4 times more likely, and you write odds are for 95% confidence interval, blah, blah, to have this outcome. So you want to write your key results, your key findings. And the last few lines of the abstract are the conclusions and implications, how we filled the important gap and why the work is important for the field. And that covers the abstract. So the common mistakes in the abstract is that the background, it has to have a clearly identified need. Methods, a common mistake is that the year of data collection and the statistics is missing. Especially year of data collection, it's very frequent. People just forget to say that the study was done in 2021. They say a study was performed. When? The results must link to the gap. Remember, the introduction has the gap, and the results show what this gap is. So we've got to make sure that the aim is linked to the results of the study, and the conclusions, they should not be a repetition, again, a repeating of the results, but it should give that interpretation in the conclusions. What are the implications? That should be the conclusion of the abstract. Now, the title is the last thing we do in a manuscript. And why? Because that is the selling point. That is the Nike, that is the Adidas, that is the Coca-Cola, that is the Apple. That's the title. So the purpose of the title is to capture the reader's attention. It shouldn't tell the entire story, but it should give a very basic of who, what, and when. A title should be short, and it shouldn't be too cute, too goofy, too silly, or too poetic. It should be straightforward. Of course, there are different writing styles, but in principle, unless you're writing for a journal that is based in the UK, at least that's my personal experience. I've seen the journals that like the Lancet or BMJ, especially BMJ, they have a more poetic, I'll say, writing, more British. Let's write more detailed English than, for instance, journals that are more international or US, or where the writing is more straightforward. So you don't want to have funny things in the title. The title should be straightforward but informative. So another important aspect is your keywords, and because when people are searching for your paper, it should be organized that your paper can be identifiable in PubMed, in Scopus, in Embase, in Web of Science. But for your paper to be identifiable, you must have it identified through keywords. So you can make sure your keywords are straightforward and linked to what you're looking for in your paper, but also your title also has areas in the title that are linked to your keywords that are of interest. So if you want to make sure that you're doing a study on smoking cessation, you want to keep the word smoking cessation in there. So with that, I'd like to wrap up today with the session. This is the TAD session. Usually this is an interactive workshop that takes place around round tables inside a conference room. And I guess unfortunately because of the pandemic, there's a different way of organizing this meeting. Would have really liked to have come to Bangkok with Dr. Agako together to look at the session on how to write a manuscript. But looking forward to meeting you all in person, maybe in a future conference, either the next APACT or another conference at a regional level. Don't know whether anything else is from our side, whether I'm still being heard. I know that there are lots of rooms inside there. Just like to ask the admin if there's anything else is needed from my side for today.
ไปแล้วเหรอ Thank you, Vardavas. Vardavas, have you seen the question and the chat inbox from the APACT member?
Let me go and find the chat.
What about the cost of publication in TID journal?
Okay, so each journal, each open access journal has different costs. Costs from journals range between, and different journals range between an open access between 1,000 and say Nature charges 5,000. TID charges about 2,000 euros for the publication. However, manuscripts that come from low-income countries and manuscripts that come from an interesting topic on an interesting area are assessed on a case-by-case basis and are provided waivers. So TID effectively provides waivers for about 30% of these abstracts that is published inside the journal. And the second question about whether TID journal is classified in Scopus and other international standards. Yes, TID is classified in Scopus, it's classified in PubMed, classified in Embase, classified in Web of Science. It has an impact factor, and its impact factor is of 2.6. And that's about TID. Just want to also, and remember that TID also is sponsoring the abstract book and has the abstract book of all abstracts of the APACT conference, and it's with pleasure and with honor with Dr. Agaku to have facilitated this, and it's been a pleasure to be able to provide the abstract book. So when the abstracts that have been accepted, you will identify them in Web of Science and Scopus very soon. So the abstracts that have been presented in APACT will be available in Scopus, Embase, and in the Web of Science within the next few weeks, which is, I think, a very good additional thing. So there's another comment here. Thanks, Dr. Vardavas, for very interesting information. It's a pleasure. I wish I could be there to be able to give a presentation in person. It would be even more interesting. But how if we couldn't get the latest data for GATS? Well, usually you can obtain data if you were to request the data from those who have collected it. For instance, in the US, there's a lot of studies, the NHANES and a lot of other population-based studies that are on the internet. And also globally, for GATS, GYTS, you can identify data. It may not be the most recent, but it may be identifiable by reaching out to those who are organizing the data collection. So it's always good if you see, for instance, there's been a recent GATS, maybe there may have been a GYTS that's been performed 2 years ago, but the data you can't find. You can reach out to those who did organize the data collection and ask them. It never harms to ask. Worst case scenario, they just respond back saying that we can't share the data, but it doesn't harm to ask. Now, another question, how can I set the attractive title? It's a bit of trial and error. You want a title that is not poetic, not silly. A proper title has the topic, the population, and the outcome. So you want in the title to have three things. The population and the population and the outcome. So it's exposure outcome, population, exposure, outcome, three things you want to see in a title: population, exposure, outcome. What are common pitfalls that you found in submissions? Okay, as my previous experience as editor, because now I'm just a strategic development editor, Dr. Agaku is the editor-in-chief of running most of the day-to-day activities. Common pitfalls in the submissions, the mistakes that I mentioned throughout the talk today, that sections, for instance, they are over, I think the biggest, most fatal flaw is the conclusions do not stem from results. Or, for instance, that you have a method section which is not described in detail, or you have an introduction that is 3 pages, 4 pages long, things like that. Those are big fatal errors in submissions. Mostly that the methods are not correctly, properly written. I think methods would probably be the most fatal. If a method section is badly written, it's also highly likely that the rest of the manuscript is going to be bad. So as an editor, I would always remember to look first at the method. If the method is described well, there's a high chance that the manuscript is going to be well written. How to overcome, another question, the language barrier for author who is not native English speaker. Now, this is a very common problem, and it's a common problem across the planet. The 2-3 options here. One option is, and you know that the more you write, the easier it is to write better. So one of the first ways to overcome the language barrier for writing is to start writing. Because it helps. I've seen this happen with a colleague who couldn't speak or really well English, who couldn't write very well English, and then he tried again and again and again and again, and now writes exceptionally well. Now, another option is use software to help you write when you're writing. I'm not advertising any specific software, but I personally use software that I can find on the internet that are for free and help you writing, because they do automatically correct some grammar, some syntax. I find it very helpful. Also, in my team, and most of my team members are in Greece, and they're not native English speakers, they speak Greek as their native tongue. I recommend that they use a software when they're writing to help them write. It's very useful. Third option is to have a more experienced person read the manuscript and help edit the manuscript. And of course, the fourth option is to use a professional English editing service, which of course costs money, so you can reach out to someone to help you improve your English. But I suggest the best approach is to use, for instance, an English software, not the autocorrect that Word has, but an external English software. I found it very useful even for myself, who am a native English speaker. It does correct my English too. So those are things that I would suggest. Any other questions for how to write a paper and what to expect from the peer review process, things like that?
I think it's no more question, because you have the answer. The last question is please give us advice how to overcome with language barrier or for other who is not native English speaker.
Yes. So my response was just presented. That response is that indeed the best approach would be to use to overcome the language barrier by either having someone read your manuscript before you submit it, or even easier, the best approach is by using software. When you're writing, is you also use text and the words. When you're reading a manuscript and you like the words, not sentences, words that others are using, you can use the words, but also use software to help write English. There are many different software on the internet, free software for native English speaking, which makes the text that you're writing, it improves the grammar, the syntax, things like that. Again, I have no reason to promote any specific software. I've been using Grammarly, for instance, and my member of my team uses Grammarly, but I've got no incentive. Just from my personal perspective, I've been using that, and it's been very helpful, both for me and for my team members. But there are many other types of software you can find on the line for free. These are for free, you don't have to pay. And you use the software to improve the syntax and grammar. And I found them very helpful, actually.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have appointment again on tomorrow. We have an appointment with topic at 9 o'clock, right? With the topic COVID-19 and tobacco.
Yes, which is 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yes,
in
that's
Greece.
right. Yes.
So I won't join from the beginning, but I will try and join later on the session for tomorrow for COVID-19 and
because on tomorrow moderator is Dr. Amon. He is the president of the Medical Association of Thailand also. Welcome again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you for the APACT member also ครับ and we'll coming up next after lunch สวัสดีครับขอบคุณครับจบแล้วนะ